Welcome to Sovereignty in Action. I'm your host, Ian Record. I am honored to be joined today by Fawn Sharp, a citizen and president of the Quinault Indian Nation in Washington State. She also serves as president of the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, and just this morning was chosen vice president of the National Congress of American Indians. In addition, she served as chair of the U.S. Department of the Interior's Commission on Indian Trust Administration and Reform. She received her Juris Doctorate from the University of Washington in 1995 and has subsequently received certificates from the National Judicial College at the University of Nevada and in International Human Rights Law from Oxford University. Welcome, President Sharp, and good to have you with us today.
Thank you. Good morning.
So I shared a little bit about who you are, but why don't you just start out by sharing a little bit more about yourself? What did I leave out?
Sure. So I grew up during the 1970s, during the height of the fishing rights controversy in the Pacific Northwest. My grandparents fished for a living. It was a very timely thing for me as a young child. I learned what the word treaty abrogation meant at 8 years old, and I learned that if I went to law school, I could, help not only my family secure fishing, but all of the Quinault citizenry. And so that really motivated me and drove me to choose a career in law. I practiced for 10 years, and then our president resigned, and a tribal elder talked to me about running for office. I got elected in 2006, 2009, 12, and 15. I'm now in my fourth term. Next month, I'll have been the president for 10 years. So between my role as lead counsel for the Quinault Nation, as an attorney and president, I've collectively, this May, it'll be 20 years of service to the Quinault Nation.
So let's talk a little bit more about Quinault before we dive into our main topics of discussion. Everybody I sit down with, I just ask them to begin by sharing a little bit more about their nation, their people, their land, their culture. Can you just paint a picture in a couple minutes of just who Quinault is for those who may not know much about?
Yes, absolutely. Quinault Indian Nation is located on the beautiful Pacific coast. We occupy about 220,000 acres of, in large part, very pristine natural habitat and environment. Within our reservation boundaries, you could find Lake Quinault, you could find clear rivers that are undeveloped from glacier to ocean. You could find 31 miles of Pacific Ocean. You could find mountains. It's just absolutely stunning beaches. It's just a gorgeous place. In our Quinault citizenry, we have close to 3,000 citizens. A good number of our citizenry are under 25, so we're a very young tribe. We have tribal affiliations from 7 other surrounding nations. To be enrolled as a matter of right under our Constitution, you have to have 1/4 blood of either Quinault or one of our affiliated tribes. And we have an 11-member tribal council, 4 executive officers, and 7 council members. We have a very active and robust general council. I'm very proud of our citizenry. Our citizenry not only raises issues with us, but routinely and consistently we'll hear from tribal citizens with their ideas, and they directly engage with the tribal council. In fact, just last week, I had a meeting with our fishermen, some elders, some of our youth were there to talk about how we could really evolve our treaty fishery from a tribally owned business, open up opportunities for individual entrepreneurs, and it was an exciting full-day discussion. So our Quinault citizens are very active, our lands are beautiful, our leaders are really taking the nation to good places right now.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I'd like to switch gears now and turn our attention to the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is commonly known by its acronym ICWA. And I'd like to start at the beginning, and I'm curious to get your perspective. What compelled tribes and tribal leaders across the country to push Congress to pass this act 4 decades ago? Why was it necessary?
It was necessary because so many of our Indian children were adopted out, completely removed from their culture, their traditions, their leaders, their lands, and it was just devastating. Story after story where you hear of an individual abruptly removed and taken out of their tribal community, out of their family, and raised in a culture that in many respects is at odds, with our culture and values. It caused a lot of harm, a lot of pain. It was just so devastating for so many generations that tribal leaders thought we need a piece of legislation that's going to ensure any Indian child that is put up for adoption, there's an opportunity for the tribe to intervene to ensure that that child stays within its own country, its own nation. its own people, its own culture, its own language, and so it was necessary at the time. But since the adoption, that was 1978, since the adoption of ICWA, I've often said that it was a great piece of legislation. It was designed to target and address, just historic injustices to our children, but it's failed in large part in implementation. And there's a GAO report that I had an opportunity to review that just chapter and verse talked about the failure of the states to properly implement and provide oversight, the federal government, HHS, to provide oversight of states and hold them accountable to implementing the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so we're now experiencing a backlash, the Baby Veronica case and others. And it's not because it's not a good piece of legislation, it's because it's failed in its implementation, because the federal government just has not been able to hold states accountable to implementing the ICWA the way Congress designed and intended it to be implemented.
So you mentioned states. What do states and counties need to understand about tribes, their cultures, their values, and their futures if they're going to seriously consider how do we live up to the spirit of ICWA in practice?
They need to understand that a child, to be raised as a Native child, needs so much more than a nuclear family, a mom and a dad. That a Native child is the product of generations of historical trauma, not just in their own life, but in their grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents have had to contend with historical trauma. And those issues are present day in any new child that's born into Native cultures. And the way that we're able to heal as a people is through our language, through that connection with our lands. And it's proven time and time again, an Indian child that's taken out, they're brought back in, there's a connection. I mean, we just have this connection that transcends generations and transcends time. We are a people that are connected to our lands, to our salmon, to our people and our cultures, our language and our traditions. And a child that's brought back in just has that connection. And so it's important for states to understand that when you're dealing with the life of a child, it is so much more than just a nuclear family that Native child needs to become whole.
So how, speaking about Quinault specifically, how are these issues around ICWA and ICWA enforcement manifesting themselves within your nation? And then what is the nation doing to resolve those challenges and ensure that Quinault children that find themselves in that position are able to stay in Quinault community?
Our biggest challenge right now is having enough foster homes, and it's licensing through our own process. Because if you go through a state licensing process, you have to have, so many rooms and square footage of your house. But in a Native community, it's not uncommon for 12 people to live in one house, So, I mean, we have that. I think on every reservation, you have not just a mom and a dad, you have mom, dad, grandma, auntie, uncle, cousin. You can have any culmination of that broader family that resides. I mean, I grew up in a house, with my grandparents, my aunts, uncles, and it was family. That was my family. So that's different, and that's unique. But getting licensed with our own culture and our own values is an issue that we're contending with right now. Because when we go through the state process, that creates a lot of barriers to licensing. And so when we have all those barriers, we don't have as many foster homes. We don't have foster homes, then they're sent outside of our community and outside of Indian country and to non-Indian citizens. So I think it's real important for us to be able to have that ability to set the standards for what is an acceptable family unit.
So is part of Quinault's work right now is to figure out devising a solution to that, to the licensing thing, and basically taking over that function, that governmental function?
Right. Because right now, we know that we have all these different barriers. We know we have a lot of kids in foster care. We know we don't have enough homes that are certified and licensed. So we need to do the work to understand what those barriers are, develop policies that are responsive to those barriers, and recruit.
So this issue has been of great concern to you, obviously because of your position as the top elected leader of your nation, but also because of your personal story. If you don't mind sharing, can you tell us why Indian Child Welfare Act hits so close to home for you?
Yes, absolutely. I took a very personal interest in ICWA, understanding we have thousands, hundreds of thousands of kids in foster care, and of those, a good percentage are Native children. I had a son for 9 years. He was an only child, and I wanted to expand our family, and I thought adoption was a good, viable option, knowing that there's so many Native kids that need a home. I went through the extensive process of being licensed. I had to go through a home study and background checks, medical checks, became certified. I was a Native certified home. And so I started to get phone calls from social workers. There was one young man, same age as my son. He was Choctaw, and I was told that we were the only Native home, and he had been adopted out. They didn't say, you can't say a lot, but they said he was adopted out of state. And to this day, I wonder if he went to a non-Indian home. Same state, Oregon, social worker called us and said, we have 3 Native children that are without a home, and we may be separating them if we can't find a home. So to go from 1 child to 3 to adopt, it was quite a leap. But prayed about it, did a lot of soul searching, and made the decision. We're ready to do this. So I grew from 1 to 4. I started the work. I was told again we're the only Native home certified, and under Indian Child Welfare Act, if there's no one in their village, Alaska village, no one in their family, that then we would be the eligible home. And so I started the work. I bought a 7-passenger SUV so I could, transport 4 kids and grandma and, mom and dad. Expanded the house. I built an addition with 2 new rooms. I was ready to welcome these children home. I was notified, and I was on an airplane, landed in Spokane, got a text message, and my heart sunk. I just knew it wasn't going to be good news if I'm getting a text message. So I called the social worker, and she explained, I'm sorry, the children were, the selection committee in Oregon, they have a committee, and they select among the applicants the children's home. And the selection committee picked another family. And my instant reaction was, weren't we the only Native family? And the person said, I can't respond to that question. I can't reveal anything about the other families. So I accepted it that day, but the next day it just incensed me to no end to think that these children could be right now being placed with a non-Indian home, and I'm a certified home, and I went through this whole process. And so I wrote a letter to the Secretary of Oregon Health and Human Services, and my question was simply, I just want to know that the Indian Child Welfare Act was complied with. And I found out that Oregon has a statute that implements ICWA, and it requires that the judge make a determination that a Native home is not deemed eligible. If there's some reason that they may be certified, but they're not in the child's best interest, it has to be a judicial determination. So I wrote the letter reciting not only ICWA, federal law, state law, and to the best of my knowledge, no judge ever deemed me disqualified. I just want to know whether. So I got a response back that we looked into this. Well, first letter, we're going to look into this. Second letter, after they looked into it, we found and determined the social worker did not follow the Indian Child Welfare Act. However, and this was something I told my family, I said, I'm almost positive they're going to find a shirt-tailed relative, because that's the only thing that could trump another Native home. So come to find out, they found a shirt-tailed relative, like a 4th cousin or a cousin of some sort, and the kids were placed with this non-Indian distant relative. And I, at that point, thought, wow, I just went through this whole process, wanted to welcome these Native kids to our home, and now it's likely they're with another second non-Indian family. I started the process, well, actually, before starting the process again, At that point, do I even want to pursue this? I've gone through 2 Native kids as a very qualified, certified Native home, and both times I get rejected. Do I even want to, expose myself to that again, go through that whole process again? But something deep in felt, yes, I believe in this. I want to provide a home. I have a great deal to offer children. So started the process again. This time, a social worker called from Absentee Shawnee Tribe. And I was very upfront. I want to make sure, and I relayed the whole experience. And this social worker from the Absentee Shawnee Tribe was very, very helpful and very much understood where I was coming from and very much understood that, we wanted to make this work. Great deal of support from the state, from the Absentee Shawnee Tribe. And this was starting probably in March. By August, at the time Quinault was hosting the tribal journeys. So we welcomed 100 canoes and 15,000 people to the shores at Quinault for the tribal journeys. That was on a Saturday. The next morning, I caught a flight to Tulsa, Oklahoma to meet these 2 boys, these Absentee Shawnee boys. That night, we went out to pizza. I took them to the Cowboy Museum. I was really nervous to meet them for the first time. I remember being up in the hotel room, getting the call from the social worker. They're here, they're in the lobby, and just checking my hair, feeling like, how am I, they're going to meet these 2 people, could be their future parents. And it was quite a moving experience to go through that when you're meeting kids for the first time, knowing that they have no family, no parents, no tribe, and you're about to bring them in. And so it was an excellent meeting. And I'll never forget the one little boy, when we took him back to the social worker, he was in the back seat. I opened the door and he said, "Am I going to see you again?" And I assured him, "I'm going to see you. I will see you again. And you're a good boy." And I really tried as much as I could to relay how loved he was and how much we wanted to bring him to Washington. They looked at the map where Washington was. That was in first part of August. Mid-August, my son was at Stanford University at a computer camp. I was about ready to go to his graduation ceremony from computer camp, and I get this phone call from an Oregon social worker that said, "Do you remember those 3 kids? Unfortunately, the home they were placed in for adoption didn't work out, and we now need another home." And I was devastated. I mean, I thought, I just met these 2 boys, assured them, and these are 3 others that I fought through 2 levels of appeal, and now I have to make the choice. But for Oregon's failure to follow ICWA in the first place, I wouldn't have been in the situation, nor would these 2 boys have had, the prospect or the idea that they would have a home, all because the state didn't follow the Indian Child Welfare Act. So for about 3 weeks, and it just crushed me. We had the boys' phone numbers, and we were calling them, and they would ask, when do we get to come to Washington? And I was trying to decide, to take those 2 or the 3, and for a good 2-3 weeks, I actually thought of taking all 5. And in some respects, I wonder if I should have taken all 5, because it was an adjustment. But I ultimately decided we would take the 3. The other 2, their father had been in prison, non-Indian father. October, their biological Native mother died. She was in her early 20s. I can only speculate what might have happened to her. Not good. Whatever we could speculate, a 20-something-year-old dying with 2 boys. And then their father had been released from prison, and right now, they are with their biological non-Indian father. And so that's some consolation for me to know that their biological dad got his act together, remarried, and they're now being raised by their father. That's a good thing. The 3 came to our house for an initial 10-day visit. I was really excited and nervous about that. The first 24 hours, I thought I was crazy. I thought, what did I get myself into? I had snacks, I had food, and they had gone through a period of neglect where they didn't have anything to eat. My 8-year-old told me, he said, "Mama, our family had been gone for so long, we decided to go look for them. And we got lost, and we couldn't find our way home. But the police found us, and that's how they came into care. They had dirty diapers, head lice. The house was in such disrepair that it ended up being demolished. They had nobody. And so they have this natural tendency to always be hungry and eating. And so for the first 24 hours, I was constantly feeding them, giving them food and giving them snacks, not realizing something in their brain wasn't regulating it. And I went to bed exhausted that first night, wondering what I did. The next day, I said, okay, kids, look, we're going to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You have a snack in the morning, a snack in the afternoon. You can have anything you want, but you only get one choice for your snack. And so we started, day 2, started putting in some structure, routine. And by the end of that 10 days, I was exhausted. And I remember dropping them off with the foster mom and taking my only child to Toys R Us and saying, hey, do you want a toy? And thinking, it was so easy to take care of just the one. And I felt just like this big relief and pressure of not having all 4. But then the next morning I woke up and I missed them terribly. For all the craziness, all the uncertainty, all the expectation, I missed them terribly. And so did my family. I mean, my son was crying when we took them. In fact, he went with me, and he was with me at Toys R Us because we dropped him off at school. It was pouring down raining, and my biological son, he walked to the door of the school, and he turned around and ran back, and he was crying. He said, Mom, don't take them. They're my brothers and my sister. Don't take them. I want to go. And so I called the school administrator. I said, I'm going to take Daniel with me. We're going to take the kids back to Oregon. And so they instantly connected within that 10 days. They then came back for Thanksgiving. And I had a feeling the foster mom was not going to pick them back up because she had this large Ford Excursion SUV. It was loaded with their toys, their clothes. She started loading it into our vehicle. And I remember calling my family on the way home saying, I don't think she's going to come get them. And that's exactly what happened. She said, I'm going to tell the social worker. It's not fair to the kids. The 8-year-old, I bought him a pillow the first trip, and it had little creatures on it, figures. And the foster mom said, this is Fawn, this is Daniel. And he had our whole family identified, and he'd cry at night when he'd go to bed. He wanted to come back to see us. And so I think they picked us as much as we picked them. And so come November, Thanksgiving, they were with us. It took until July to get a document that proved they were placed with us, to get medical cards. And so for that whole period of time, I wasn't getting a lot of cooperation from the state. And fortunately, they didn't have any, they were sick, but I was able to treat them with over-the-counter. But I was so happy nothing seriously happened to them, because it was hard to get any kind of medical attention for them. But that just goes to show the challenge of trying to, have an open house, do everything you can to prepare, be ready, and then just series after series. And it made me realize, no wonder why so many people give up, why it's so hard to recruit, Native families, and why.
I mean, ultimately, you're at the mercy of another governmental entity that may or may not be truly committed to enforcing ICWA.
Yes. And
can subjectively interpret ICWA if they so choose, because there's nothing that compels them to do otherwise.
Yes.
And so, following up on that, these new ICWA regulations that have been formulated, are working their way through the process, on the verge of being released. How do you see those regulations improving matters and perhaps keeping somebody else from
Yes.
Encountering the same scenario you did?
I think the regulations will do a lot to hold states accountable to implementing ICWA the way it was designed. I had asked some folks earlier this week if budgets are going to accompany those regulations, because for those regulations to be implemented, again, the way they were designed, the way ICWA was designed, it's going to take some budget investment. And that was what the GAO report said. The HHS was not holding states accountable. Their response was, we don't have the budget. So in my mind, I think it's going to go a long way to hold states accountable, but we need, as tribal leaders, to ensure that it has a chance, that it has the budgetary backing, that implementation and execution will happen the way it was designed.
Well, President Sharp, we really appreciate you taking some time to share your thoughts, experience, wisdom, and story
Yes.
with us. Good luck with your family. Good
Thank
luck
you.
with the nation's work.
I should say the kids were placed with us November, and they'd spent 2 years with us. And next month, the adoption will have been final for 1 year. So they've been with us 3 years.
Well, that's great. That's great. Well, that's all the time we have on today's episode of Sovereignty in Action, a program of the National Congress of American Indians. To learn more about Sovereignty in Action, please visit NCAI's website at www.ncai.org. Thank you for joining us. Copyright 2016, National Congress of American Indians.